She's the most successful serial killer whose name you've probably never heard. Guilia Tofana killed hundreds of men in the 17th century in Italy when she turned her makeup business into a poison factory. Her mission? To help aspiring widows realize their dreams. Her downfall? Loose lips and a bowl of soup. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. If you enjoyed today's story, I hope you'll consider subscribing. The year was 1633 in Palermo, Italy, at the end of the Renaissance era, an era of arranged marriages that left no possibility of divorce. Girls and women were considered property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. And if a husband mistreated his wife, abused her, kept her in poverty, decided to prostitute her, or put her in danger in any way, there were really no legal protections for her as a woman. The men were free to cheat, though the mistresses were said to have been treated just as badly as the wives. It's said that during those times, women had only one of three options: to get married, to stay single and rely on sex work to survive, or to become a respected and well-off widow. During this time, the only way out of an unhappy union was death. And since many women were forced into arranged marriages by their family, and men had no laws stopping them from treating their wives however they pleased, there were a lot of abusive husbands and a lot of unhappy wives. And because of this, many women found the third option to be the most attractive. Luckily for them, 17th century Rome had a flourishing criminal, magical underworld that provided the services to make this possible. This underground community was found in many of the large European cities, and it was made up of alchemists, apothecaries, and experts in quote-unquote black magic. In reality, these experts really didn't dabble in the dark arts as much as they were solving problems that doctors and priests of the time either couldn't solve or just morally would not participate in. But poisoning your husband obviously came at a great risk. If you're caught, you would be put to death. So while poison was readily available, being able to get away with using said poison, well, that required a more sophisticated skill set. And this is where the subject of today's video comes in. Guilia Tofana is believed to have been born around 1620 in Palermo, Sicily, to Tofana da Mondo. Giulia's mother had her own dark history, and in 1633, she was executed for the murder of her husband, having allegedly poisoned him. Now, there are no portraits of Giulia, and most of her past is unclear. Considering she is one of the most deadliest female serial killers in history, many find it surprising how little information there is out there about her, but I personally would argue that is probably why she was as successful as she was. The legend goes that she came to the aid of many unhappy and abused wives with her special makeup. As I previously mentioned, the use of toxins and poisons in the Middle Ages and Renaissance was widespread, and some even made their living as professional poisoners. And back then it was apparently so common for women to poison their husbands in order to come into their fortunes that poisons were often known as inheritance powders. Many believed that this is how Giulia got her secret recipe, as an inheritance powder passed down from her mom. But Giuliana was also known to spend a lot of time in apothecaries watching the alchemists as they made their potions. And if the stories about her mom were true, well, she got caught. So maybe she got a starter recipe from her mom, and then she learned more from the alchemist of how to perfect the recipe and make it more like untraceable. Either way, when she started her cosmetic business, Guilia Tofana was described as a beautiful young widow. It makes you wonder, was her husband her first guinea pig? So Giuliana had a daughter, Girolama Spara, and after becoming a widow, Giulia took her daughter and moved to Naples and then Rome. Giulia started her company in a time when women didn't really have businesses, but it's believed the success of her business was in the fact that she was not really selling cosmetics, but instead a deadly concoction that she called Aqua Tofana. I've been trying to figure out why that sounds so familiar. It just sounds so familiar to me, and I don't think I'd ever really heard this story before, so I don't know. Aqua Tofana. The exact composition of Aqua Tofana is unknown, but it's said that arsenic, belladonna, and lead were components of the mixture. Back then, these were actually all common ingredients used in cosmetics, so it wasn't at all suspicious to have these ingredients just laying around. However, they were highly toxic if ingested. Aqua Tofana was said to have no odor, no scent, and no taste, which made it very easy for an unhappy wife to slip a little in her husband's food or drink. So, let's take a closer look at some of the ingredients. Lead at the time was a very common ingredient for facial powders, and it was used to lighten the skin. Now, interesting side note, you guys may have heard the stories that have come out in recent years about how Queen Elizabeth I was poisoned by her lead makeup. However, white lead by itself actually isn't able to be absorbed into the skin, and it's only poisonous if it's ingested or inhaled, which I guess if it was in a powder form would probably be kind of easy to inhale it. But according to Professor McNeil of McMaster University, the only lead makeup that would have actually been poisonous are recipes that used like a formulation with some other ingredient that would somehow change the form of the lead or soften the outer layer of the person's skin. This would then allow the lead to be absorbed into the skin. Now, Professor McNeil and his team, they make a lot of lead makeup using recipes dating from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And it's said that they test the makeup on ethically sourced pig skin, whatever that means. And they've tried to find pig skin that is closest to like a really light white human skin color, and they found that the overdone white powder like you see in theaters and movies, like the depiction of that time, is actually not a true representation. It's actually not a true representation of what most of the recipes would make the makeup that it would result from that would look like. The makeup actually does make the skin a little bit whiter, but most of the recipes actually work a lot like modern cosmetics, and they simply diffuse reflectance of the skin. Essentially, the makeup makes the light bounce off the skin in a certain way that makes the skin appear more bright or dewy. Again, like the goal of a lot of modern cosmetics. And when you look at the toxicity of the formulations, Professor McNeil actually said that the most toxic mixture they have observed so far is the very simple formulation said to have been used by England's Queen Elizabeth I, and that was a mixture of white lead and vinegar. This mixture passed lead through the skin in much higher quantities than other recipes, and Professor McNeil believes this raises the question of whether it's worth revisiting some of Elizabeth I's health problems if they were in fact due to or exasperated by the lead poisoning. I thought it was interesting because it kind of explains why everyone wasn't just dropping dead all the time from like lead poisoning, because like when you hear those stories you're like, wouldn't they have figured this out? But apparently some of it wasn't poisonous while others were. It just depended on what they were mixing together. So side tangent. Also, I find it interesting to note that they weren't necessarily all running around with caked on baby powder looking faces. So that's something. Moving on to the more obvious poisonous ingredient, arsenic. Arsenic has been known as the king of poisons and the poisons of kings all the way since ancient Rome. This poison causes its victims to vomit and have diarrhea, symptoms which were actually easily mistaken for many other common diseases of that day. And a very small dose can be highly toxic, and it can either kill quickly or very slowly, just depending on how the person decides to use it. Arsenic's versatility made it an almost perfect murder weapon for years, and it was available for anybody to buy at the apothecary shop as a rat poison, and arsenic was also used as a cosmetic to lighten the skin. And many speculate that's probably why Guilia Tofana decided to use arsenic in her concoction. So while it's well known even at that time to be a poison, the fact that it was also used for many other non-nefarious uses made it easy to claim that it was simply a cosmetic if somebody found it lying around your house. Another key ingredient in Guilia's poison was belladonna. The name belladonna itself means beautiful lady in Italian, but the plant's also one of the most toxic in the world. Even though this was a known fact, Renaissance women would extract liquid from the berries and transform it into a cosmetic. Women would place one drop in each eye to make the belladonna dilate their pupils. Now, this was said to have given them a luminous, arresting look. And I saw where some people were making fun of this, but I actually have seen several modern day studies in recent years actually talking about how men find women more attractive when their pupils are dilated. And that's part of why low lighting is considered more romantic. So, gives you that doe-eyed look. Belladonna had some pretty nasty side effects, which included increased heart rates, blurred vision, and even led to blindness. But back then, I guess the women, they just thought it was worth it. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if these ladies were like, maybe if I look beautiful enough, he won't beat me. Like, who knows? I mean, that was a tough time for women. In Guilia Tofana's potion, the belladonna combined with the arsenic killed the victim. It's no wonder belladonna's fruit was called the devil's berries. A writing in a Chambers journal stressed the horror of strong men reduced to nothing by his wife and tells us that the poison was a subtle killer. It talked about how the poison would be administered in wine or tea or some other kind of liquid by the flattering tincturess, and the first dose produced a scarcely noticeable effect. The husband would become a little out of sorts. He would feel a little sick, but not quite sick enough to call a doctor. But once they would then be administered a second dose, maybe the next day or something, the weakness would become more pronounced. The woman, of course, would express so much anxiety about her husband's sickness, and she would be so distraught, call the doctors, all the things, to the point where she wouldn't be considered an object of suspicion and would even perhaps continue to prepare her husband's food at the doctor's instruction and then administer the third dose. And this is what would prostrate even the most vigorous man. The doctor would become completely puzzled. I mean, maybe they thought it was just a simple cold or something they saw all the time. They would just give them, the regular old remedy that usually cured it. And they would come back the next day and they would be even more sick. And to the doctor's dismay, no matter what they did, the victim would eventually die after a few days from what appeared to be a progressive illness. Now, the wife, being smart, this was all planned out, she would save her reputation by demanding that the doctor did a post-mortem examination. Of course, the results would come back nothing found, and the woman would be able to then prove that she was innocent. So if anyone ever came back and, accused her of anything, she's like, look, I'm the one who demanded that this be taken care of. I'm the one who demanded the doctor do examination, like nothing shady going on here. The doctor can vouch for her, and they know that, there was no signs of foul play. And so if a year or two later the woman decided to remarry, no one could blame her. She was within her right. These writings go on to describe how the indetectability of Aqua Tofana was the poison's greatest asset. Nothing was detectable on the exam at all, and its slow action had two key benefits. It made the symptoms produced by its victim resemble those of an advancing disease, and it also allowed the dying husband time to put his affairs in order, which usually meant ensuring his soon-to-be widow would be well taken care of after his death. He was able to repent of his sins and make sure that all of his assets were written to his wife's name to make sure she got all the money to take care of her once he died. And since he was able to repent of his sin, this was believed that it would guarantee his entry into heaven, and his killer didn't even have to feel much guilt over the fate of her husband's eternal soul. Guilia Tofana's poison became known as an early Italian divorce because it gave women the power to get out of their unhappy marriages by killing their husbands and becoming widows. Guilia sold her poison concoction in two different forms. First, she disguised Aqua Tofana as a powdered makeup, and women would set the small container out on their dressing tables next to their other lotions and perfumes, and no one would be the wiser. It wouldn't raise any suspicion. It just looked like another cosmetic. But Tofana's second disguise was even more ingenious because she sold Aqua Tofana in small vials with the image of Saint Nicholas of Bari. Now, the vial claimed to be manna of Saint Nicholas of Bari. It was actually a popular healing oil at the time for blemishes that looked like a very devout object. And having this in their possession made a woman appear to be very devout and religious, which of course would make them look even more innocent. Because of the reputation of women to poison their husbands and being such a common thing in medieval and early modern Europe, and the fact that poison was so closely associated with cosmetic, historian Annette Drubert claims that Renaissance Renaissance plays featuring women like sitting there applying face paint on stage was actually a reference to women's false and poisonous nature. Now, other people I've heard reporting on this talk about it like they look down on women, but I mean, it kind of sounds like it was a big issue that men were being poisoned like so regularly that it was like a thing, you know? It was probably advice people gave when they got married, like, man, watch what she's feeding you. Like, honestly, can you blame them for thinking women are stinky if they had to constantly worry they were being poisoned? I can't blame them there. I mean, obviously they were. Though you would think that someone would have a thought to maybe start treating their wives better, like happy wife, happy life. Like, that's probably where that saying came from, honestly. Clearly, Guilia was not the only woman associated with poisoning people in the Renaissance, not by a long shot. There was even a daughter of a pope in the 1400s who was rumored to have already been on her third husband by the age of 22. And the rumor was that she had a ring filled with poison. She would just open the ring over their wine and dump a little arsenic in. So yeah, I'm just saying, that was definitely a thing back in those days. With the help of her daughter and a group of reliable women, Guilia gained a reputation as a friend to troubled women, and according to accounts, Guilia's business successfully fooled the authorities for decades throughout the 17th century. Aqua Tofana was believed to have been sold for nearly 50 years disguised as a cosmetic. Her group of poisoners may have also been successful because it said that they recruited a local Roman priest, Father Girolamo, to secretly take part in their criminal network. Information, of course, is spotty. This was such a long time ago. Really only have like people's writings that could have been hearsay, but it's generally believed that this priest actually supplied them with the arsenic for the poisoning, and Tofana and her colleagues disguised it as a cosmetic for their customers, which it sounded like this stuff was easy to get, so I don't know what they would really need the priest for truly. But if anyone were to ask about Tofana's booming business, all she had to do was show them her bottles of Aqua Tofana. It was considered a very coveted face cream for women looking to be single again. Like, okay, everybody wanted this cream. It could just be the most awesomest cream ever, but she literally had that on the packaging. It was for women who were looking to be single again. And like, that was a little on the nose. But like we mentioned earlier, she packaged her poison in such a way that it could easily blend in with any of the other makeups, lotions, or perfumes on a woman's vanity. Another key component in the success of this whole charade was that everyone who was involved in it had something to lose. I mean, anyone who's looking to poison their husband to get an early Italian divorce, they had just as much to lose as Guilia did by selling the stuff. And so everybody kept this to themselves and stayed tight-lipped about it. And it's also said that Guilia actually only took customers by referrals. If you're referring somebody, then obviously you're basically vouching that they're not going to throw all of us under the bus kind of thing. Now, some people believe that the referral-only model is part of what made this cream so sought after, while others believe that the cream was actually sold to some women who were not let in on the little secret part of the business, and therefore this made it seem even more legitimate because the cosmetics could be found in the homes of many women whose husbands were still alive and well. And still others believed that some women bought the cream just kind of as a insurance policy should they ever need it. However, the whole thing came crashing down in the late 1600s when a woman served her husband a bowl of soup laced with a drop of Aqua Tofana, but before her husband could take a spoonful, she kind of like had a change of heart. She freaked out. She knocked the spoon out of his hand. She's begging him not to eat the soup. Of course, the husband's immediately like, okay, what is going on with you? So it says he kind of like beat her up or whatever until she confessed, and she confesses to poisoning his food. So of course he immediately turns her over to police. This floozy's trying to poison me, right? And she admits that she had purchased Aqua Tofana from Guilia. So even after this wife's confession, Guilia wasn't actually immediately arrested. For one thing, many of her customers were very grateful for her services, and so they didn't want her to be captured. But one of the versions of what could have possibly happened is that Guilia was actually already retired and that she was living in a country estate. And so being that she wasn't in the middle of the city, it gave people some time to like get word to her that they were on to her and they were coming for her and all of that. And so she had time to escape, and it took a while for authorities to actually catch up to Guilia and execute her. But another version of events, which is the one that seems to be the most widely believed, is that Guilia was still living in Rome, but someone got a warning to her in enough time that she was able to run to a nearby church and she was able to beg for for sanctuary there, which was granted to her. However, shortly after, a rumor was spread that she had actually used Aqua Tofana to poison the local water supply, and then everybody was about to die. So this rumor stirred up a mob who came storming down to the church, and they physically removed her from the church and surrendered her to the authorities. After authorities brutally tortured Julia for however long it took, it said that she confessed to killing as many as 600 men with the use and sale of her poison in just an 18-year span between 1633 and 1651, making her the mastermind behind one of the most notorious murder plots in history. The death toll could have actually been a lot higher, or it could be that Julia, who was actually an elderly woman at this point, simply made up a number that was high enough to where the authorities were finally satisfied and quit torturing her. I mean, it's hard to say, but torture is notorious for false confessions, so it could have all been a lie, but I mean, she was really selling this stuff for 50 years. I don't think 600 seems that high. That's like saying, oh, I sold 600 bottles in a 50-year time. I mean, that's very highly believable. But in this version of the story, she and her daughter and their 3 employees were all executed in 1659, though some people do say that it wasn't until 1709, so there's some conflict in how long her reign of terror went. But they were executed in Campo di Flora, and her body was tossed back over the wall of the church that had offered her sanctuary for the clergymen to dispose of. While under torture, it said that she gave up the names of many of the people who had helped her or had been customers. And some of the people she named were able to flee, but many of them were captured, executed, or imprisoned. And it's believed that more than 40 of Tofana's lower class customers were executed, while women of the upper classes were either imprisoned, executed quietly to avoid scandal, or were able to escape punishment altogether by insisting that they never even knew the cosmetics were actual poison. The remaining co-conspirators who weren't able to escape were said to have been either hanged or walled up, bricked into the dungeons at the Palazzo Pucci. Now, while all the details are spotty, some of them are debated, this story is actually believed to be true based on numerous writings about how all of this went down and actually how long the story continued to be told. Over a century later, when the famous composer Mozart fell ill at the age of 35, he allegedly said,
"I feel definite that I will not last much longer. I am sure that I have been poisoned. I cannot rid myself of this idea. Someone has given me Aqua Tofana and calculated the precise time of my death."
Now, most scholars don't believe that Mozart's death was caused by poisoning, even though in the newspapers of that time, it actually was reported that he had died of poisoning, and much less that it was by this particular concoction of Aqua Tofana. There have actually been pages and pages of conflicting information on what possibly killed Mozart by many of the doctors who actually examined him during the weeks leading up to his death. Some doctors have said Mozart had severe hypochondria, and that's what killed him, which, if that's true, it's really sad, but also would explain why he would think he had been poisoned by something that was developed over 100 years prior. I don't think that's true though, because he was said to have been ill quite often. There have been actually over 100 different theories as to what Mozart's cause of death could be, over the years of people trying to guess. But it's said that Mozart actually had a lifelong issue with tonsillitis, and the general consensus nowadays is that he likely died from bronchial pneumonia or some type of strep infection. Luckily, Guilia Tofana's exact recipe was never recorded, though arsenic is now something we can detect, so don't be getting any weird ideas. But because of Giulia's story, Belladonna has become synonymous with the term beautiful woman, though its more accurate nickname is deadly nightshade. So, what do you guys think of this one? Do you think Julia was a hero or a villain? I mean, I can see the desperation that some of these women were probably feeling, and I do think some argument could be made for self-defense, but at the same time, it's how do you determine which one is a battered wife who's truly in fear for her life, and which ones are just gold diggers who want to get rid of their husbands so they can spend their money? You know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't know, man. I don't think there's necessarily ever a justification for murder, but I do think they lived in a different time, and life just seemed a lot harder for women back then. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, and until next time, share this episode with a friend who you think might enjoy it, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Bye.